Good morning. Let's begin. So last week and part of the week before, as part of our study of the Messianic prophecies in the book of Zechariah, we looked in Zechariah chapter 6, verses 9 through 15, which is a very important prophecy that we spent some time covering. And now we move on to a brief couple of verses in the middle of a prophecy where the language turns messianic. The whole chapter is a prophecy, and there's a couple of messianic verses in the middle of it. And verses 1 through 8 is all about pronouncing judgment on all of the enemies of Israel. And interestingly, I don't think it's a coincidence, I think it's prophetic. The order of the countries being judged is exactly the order that almost 200 years later, Alexander the Great conquered those countries. Zechariah was writing in about 520 BC. In about 333 BC, Alexander the Great reached the Middle East in his conquests. And in the order that we find these countries in the first 8 verses, Alexander conquered them. So I think that was part of God's judgment on them. And we mentioned before that when the prophets come, and they sometimes have some very harsh rebukes for the people of Israel. You've engaged in idolatry and so on. It might occur to the people of Israel, well, what about all these other countries around us? They're even worse. Does God care about that? And so the reason for God to pronounce these judgments on the enemies of Israel is not to be vengeance-seeking or harsh, but to point out that, yes, justice does apply to everyone. It's not like if you're the chosen people, you get a certain standard applied to you and everybody else can just do whatever they want and nothing ever happens to them. So it's comforting to God's people to know, yes, God has a standard for everyone. God does punish those who reject him and engage in idolatry, whether they are Israelites or anybody else. Verse 7 concerns the Philistines, and it's a little bit interesting. Before we move on to the Messianic passage, it says, I will remove the blood from their mouths and the abhorrent things from between their teeth. That's probably language about the sacrifices, their pagan sacrifices, and their eating of the pagan sacrifice, their eating of blood and the abhorrent meat that they've offered. Then they too will become a remnant for our God. They will become like a clan in Judah, and Ekron like the Jebusites. Now, when we hear the word remnant, how is that usually applied? It says they will become a remnant for God's people. That means generally some fraction, like when Elijah was told, when Elijah was feeling like he was the only faithful man left and he was being persecuted, and God told him, no, I have a faithful remnant in the land that I will preserve. So this remnant is the faithful people. But he's talking about Philistines, right? They will become a remnant for our God. In other words, some fraction of them must end up getting absorbed into the nation of God. And there's a reference there to the Jebusites. They will become like, their city of Ekron will become like the Jebusites. Well, the Jebusites were the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. In fact, if you go back far enough in archaeology and so on, Jerusalem was called Jebus. And the Jebusites were those who lived there. And they were not fully conquered in the time of Joshua in the conquest. Because later, they're referred to in the Bible that the citadel of the Jebusites was finally conquered in the time of King David. So picture that. They're living and they're sharing the same city. They're getting along. They weren't all annihilated. And there are passages after that someone was identified as a Jebusite. But they were absorbed into basically the tribe of Judah. The ones who would follow God, they weren't killed off. They were absorbed into the tribe of Judah. And so God is saying through Zechariah that basically when Alexander the Great conquers these lands, some of these people will turn to God. Not all of them, not most of them, a remnant of them will turn to God and they'll be absorbed into Judah, into God's people.
What was the time frame you said that Jerusalem was known as Jebus?
Oh, that's way, way back. I mean, that's before the conquest of the land and so on. Even though Jebusites still lived there, it was being called Jerusalem by that time. So many, many centuries before this, more than 1,000 years before this. And interestingly, the Philistines just kind of disappear from history. If you look up in an encyclopedia or a history book, what about the Philistines? There's not some decisive point in time. They just kind of don't get mentioned anymore. They pass from the pages of history. Most of them are conquered, and some of them now just kind of get absorbed into God's people. Kind of interesting when you consider that God's people were supposed to conquer their land and never did, and that was a source of trouble throughout centuries. But now, after those preliminary verses, we get to a messianic prophecy and see if you spot any language that's familiar to Christians. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. And I underline, as usual, the messianic languages. He is righteous and victorious, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. The bow of war will be removed, and he will proclaim peace to the nations. His dominion will extend from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. Now, the ends of the earth language is messianic language because even though in the time of Jesus the Jews were still expecting their Messiah for their benefit, all of the messianic prophecies as a whole in the Old Testament keep returning to this idea that every nation will be blessed through the Messiah, and every nation will come to obey the Messiah. It's not just for the Jews. To the ends of the earth. And we have here the picture of the victorious king, but also it's a picture of a peaceful king. Those ideas are a little bit in tension with each other. Is there any language in here that is obvious language that we recognize? Right. Palm Sunday, Hosanna, he's riding on the donkey and the people are greeting him. That's explicitly listed as a fulfillment of that prophecy.
Was he riding on a donkey or a colt?
Well, the colt of the donkey, next to its mother, the adult donkey. So, in the ancient Near East, the donkey was a symbol of peace, as opposed to a horse. If we take a look in the passages in the book of Judges, when a king or a judge is riding on a donkey, it means he's not a military judge. Not all the judges in the book of Judges were fighting militarily against the oppressors of God's people. The other meaning of judge is someone who is like a local ruler, who hears cases and passes judgment and so on, like a judge today. Someone who does that without leading militarily is a judge, but he's a peaceful kind of judge. And then there are other judges like Samson who do nothing but military service to God. So we have some examples here. Judges 5, verse 10. There are some judges that you frankly don't always remember all that much because they are strictly peaceful, but one war song is the song in Judges chapter 5 of Deborah and Barak after the great military victory. But even in the midst of that, in that song in verse 10 it says, "You who ride on white donkeys, who sit on saddle blankets, and who travel on the road, give praise." That's a symbol of the peace that comes after military victory. They're praising those who will rule in peace. Now, but to take a Judges chapter 10, verse 4, well, verses 3 and 4, "After him came Jair the Gileadite, who judged Israel for 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 young donkeys. They had 30 towns in Gilead, which are called Jair's villages to this day." So he was a ruler, a peaceful ruler. He and his sons ruled over 30 villages, and they're symbolized by the donkeys that they rode on, because that's a sign that they were peaceful. Not that they had conquered those villages, but that they were leaders of those villages. And then in chapter 12 of Judges, we read in verses 13 and 14, "After Elon," which is another judge that we don't know much about, "Abdon, son of Hillel, who was from Pirathon, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. Abdon judged Israel 8 years." So these non-military judges are symbolized by they rode on donkeys. They were peaceful leaders. But we also see it with respect to David. And that's a little bit more of a messianic type. In 2 Samuel 16, after or in the middle of the revolt by David's son Absalom, where Absalom is trying to seize the kingdom and will even kill David if he can. The beginning of 2 Samuel 16, it says, when David had gone a little beyond the summit, Ziba, Mephibosheth's servant, was right there to meet him. He had a pair of saddled donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 bunches of summer fruit, and a skin of wine. The king said to Ziba, "Why do you have these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride. The bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine is for those who become exhausted to drink in the desert." This is a symbol of David seeking peace. This is a sign that Ziba recognizes that David wants peace. David doesn't really want to defeat Absalom, which would probably mean Absalom's death. And of course, David tried to prevent Absalom's death. but that got out of his hands. David is pictured messianically here, I think, as a peaceful man on a donkey. Now, the other language we see, a colt of a donkey, that means basically a purebred, not a mule. Because if it were a crossbred mule, they wouldn't be called a colt or foal. And horses, by contrast to donkeys and mules, were seen as military. If a bunch of people come riding into your town on horseback, that might be the enemy cavalry coming. Horses pull chariots. Nobody has donkeys pull chariots in the army. The cavalry doesn't ride on a bunch of donkeys. The horses were therefore a symbol of military power. So it's significant that the Messiah is going to arrive on a young donkey. That's a picture of the Messiah bringing peace rather than conquest. But despite that, what were all the Israelites looking for? They wanted a conquering king to come in and kick the rear ends of the Romans and, drive them from the land and so on. But they'd already been given the image and the type of David that the Messiah will be peaceful. So it's humble, and the Messiah is described as humble. And riding on a donkey is humble, but it's not just humility, it's also a sign of peace. And of course, we have in Matthew 21 and John 12, we have quotations of this. When Jesus makes his triumphant entry on Palm Sunday into Jerusalem, Matthew and John both quote, "This fulfills the prophecy of Zechariah." This fulfills the prophecy that he would arrive on the colt or foal of a donkey. So this is a very clear messianic prophecy that Jesus fulfilled. And you would think that when the Jews are familiar with the messianic prophecy, they're looking for it to be fulfilled. But they really weren't, were they? It would have been a lot of them would have been a lot happier if Jesus and his 12 disciples had ridden in on a bunch of horses with spears and, and so on. That's really more what they wanted. But the prophecy was there all along. Now the other key here, he's called the victorious king. But the word that's translated victorious or triumphant in most of our modern translations is also in some other verses translated as having salvation or giving salvation, depending on the context. Now think about how that would apply to the Messiah. Giving salvation would be obvious. That's what the Messiah did for us. He gave salvation. But what about having salvation? The King James Version, for example, has having salvation rather than triumphant or victorious. Having salvation could mean the Messiah will be saved from death when he comes. Now that could just mean preventing his death, but more literally it means what? He experiences death and then he's saved from it, which is exactly what happened with Jesus as Messiah in the resurrection. Bringing could mean he brings us salvation. So either way, it would be fitting. But the word salvation is also used in a material world sense quite a few times in the Old Testament. Right? So even if the Jews interpreted this and translated this as the Messiah will bring salvation, couldn't they still interpret it as that means he's going to conquer the Romans and save us from the Romans and so on? It doesn't have to mean spiritual, eternal salvation in their minds. So it's always possible to interpret differently. In Zechariah chapter 12, we get to another brief messianic prophecy. The first 9 verses are talking about someday Jerusalem being besieged, conquered, destroyed. But then verse 10 comes along to offer grace, where Zechariah says, in the words of God, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn." Now, if you look at what I've got underlined there, God is identified in this passage with him whom they have pierced. Now, that caused some problems in interpretation among the Jews, because they reasoned it must mean something else, because how can God be pierced, like with nails or a sword or something? God doesn't have a body. So what could this mean? How can, he doesn't say just the Messiah shall be pierced, which we've already seen in Isaiah 53. He says, me whom they have pierced, God speaking. So that caused some issues that we'll get to in Judaism. It's a suffering servant kind of passage. So he can't be just the victorious king if he's going to be pierced and they're going to mourn over him. Right? There's got to be more to the Messiah than conquest. And so a lot of translations tried to work around the confusion by changing the language so that it doesn't sound like it's God who is pierced. It's some unidentified person. But in the Hebrew language, as we see in a standard translation, it's God who is pierced. And that brings us to a topic that I haven't really touched on much in my teaching of Messianic prophecy, but you might suspect that the Jews don't have all the same interpretations of these Messianic prophecies as I'm presenting, because they, in particular, don't think they apply to Jesus, right? They have to have some way of interpreting these prophecies that's not fulfilled in Jesus. And I haven't belabored that point, but I think this is one good example. I mentioned before that the Jews had a hard time figuring out how one Messiah could be the conquering king and the suffering servant who gets pierced and killed for the sins of all the people, and a priest, because priests and kings aren't the same person in the old law. They don't even come from the same tribe. They're not allowed to be the same person. And a new prophet greater than Moses. How can one person be all of these things? And so they typically interpreted the Messianic passages as referring to 2 or 3 people, a Messiah and someone who came along with him. And so the simplest was to have only 2. They have a Messiah called Messiah ben David, ben meaning son of, Messiah son of David, and Messiah son of Joseph, which is kind of interesting that they chose the name Joseph, because Jesus was son of Joseph, but that was a name they chose before that. And so that the Messiah son of Joseph could fulfill the role of suffering servant, while Messiah son of David could be the king. And now another interpretation among some of the rabbis was there's only one Messiah, but he comes twice. In his first coming, he gets pierced and killed for the sins of the people. And in his second coming, he comes as a king to reign forever. Well, now that's kind of an interesting concept for Christians, because no doubt the Jews who became Christians in the New Testament could easily adapt their existing belief to fit Jesus. Jesus, in his first coming, is pierced. He's the suffering servant. He's killed for the sins of the people. He's mourned. And in his second coming someday, he comes as a king to reign forever. So that would fit just fine, actually, with what happened with Jesus. In Judaism today, of course, that interpretation would present a problem, because that would open up the possibility that Jesus is Messiah ben Joseph. The suffering servant who comes the first time is pierced and killed for the sins of the people. Now, even though that's one of their historic interpretations, now a lot of them are going to want to try to move away from that. So they came up with other interpretations. One of which was maybe it's not the Messiah who's slain. Maybe it's the evil inclination in man that gets slain when the Messiah comes. Maybe you can spiritualize the language of piercing and slaying and say that it's sin being conquered, sin being slain, when someday, when the Messiah comes, and they're still looking for the Messiah to come. But that's the less popular interpretation, because, as one rabbi pointed out 1,000 years ago in the medieval Jewish writings, that doesn't really make sense here, because the response to the Messiah being pierced is that everyone grieves, like when you've lost a child. Is everyone going to be grieving if the evil inclination in man has been destroyed? That doesn't sound like an opportunity for grieving and weeping and so on. Weeping bitterly for him. I mean, it sounds like a person who is killed and you're weeping for him. It doesn't sound like you can spiritualize it all and make it about sin being conquered or sin being killed, because you wouldn't be weeping bitterly and grieving that. And I've got multiple translations at home. The standard Hebrew translation to English, published by the Jewish Publication Society, has gone through different revisions, and in the oldest one I have, from the 1960s, it reads pretty much like our Christian Bibles read. He, referring to the Messiah and identifying the Messiah with God, he gets pierced. But in the more recent editions, they've changed the language. Instead of him, it becomes them, even though the Hebrew is singular. An unspecified them get pierced and killed. And then you can say, well, maybe it's like an army of the Messiahs that gets defeated, or something, But that's just not what the Hebrew says, and that's not what even the Hebrew translations into English ever said until the last few decades. So the way the prophecy is written, it presents some interpretive issues within Judaism. You have God is the Messiah, and the Messiah who is God, God speaking in the first person, it gets pierced. That's a problem, for Jewish interpreters even today. But for us, well, it seems pretty natural, knowing what happened with the Messiah, that he was crucified when he came. Right? So, we'll look at a couple of more Zechariah prophecies next week. Thank you.